we were commissioned by Save the Children, Cali and I, to do a meta-analysis that looks at the highest quality evaluation evidence of economic strengthening interventions, where the researchers happen to look at children's outcomes. And it turns out it's pretty rare that that researchers do look at children's outcomes from this kind of programming, even when they're implemented by child protection actors, interestingly. So next slide, please. Here's what we're going to talk about. I'll mention the objectives of the study. I'll define economic strengthening, livelihoods work as we defined it, and Cali will talk about the methodology of the study, and then we'll both talk about some of the findings. Next slide. The objectives of the study were to look at different kinds of economic strengthening approaches for their value in improving child well-being. And we were hoping to find that there would be one or more type of economic intervention that you could do that would get you better outcomes for children. We also wanted to understand any potential negative impacts that these programs have, because we know from anecdotal evidence that they can have negative impacts, especially on schooling and child labor. We wanted to look at mediating factors like sex and age of the beneficiary to see if the way you deliver the program, to whom you deliver the program, makes a difference in how well it serves the children in a household. And then we wanted to look at gaps in the evidence base as well. So the next slide. When I talk about economic strengthening, I'm talking about what's colloquially known often as livelihoods program, and the definition I'm using is very inclusive. So there's 15 or 20 different approaches that people take all around the world. Any kind of microeconomic programming that works to build income or assets. There are many approaches, as you know, so credit, savings, vocational skills training. We didn't find all of these in the RCT literature, in the randomized control trial literature, but the ones we do file, we report on. This is a research synthesis of RCT evaluations of programs that work to build income or economic assets, either of the caregiver, of the household, or the individual child, adolescent, youth, etc., where the evaluation looked at any kind of child level outcomes from that work. Approaches to economic strengthening can be divided into two major categories: those that engage caregivers as the primary beneficiaries and those that engage children directly, and we look at both of them in this study. Cali Mortenson Ellis, my colleague, is going to talk now about the methods that we used.
Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with a brief overview of randomized control trials, or RCTs, which is the methodology we're looking in for our studies. In one of the polls you did before the webinar, Kate mentioned there was about a 50-50 split between people that were familiar with this type of evaluation and those that were not. So what you see on the screen is the simplest explanation for what an RCT is. It's the most rigorous method available for evaluating the effectiveness of the program. For example, if an intervention is provided to all participants in a community and we see a positive result, there is no way of knowing if the positive result happened because of the intervention or if it would have happened anyway. Maybe things were getting better for everyone in the community anyway and the intervention wasn't really necessary. So the only way to know if a program works is to isolate it from other things that are happening in the world. And the only way to do this is to randomly assign certain people to the quote-unquote treatment group that experiences the program and a control group that does not. You should know that in practice, this is often done by dividing eligible participants into two groups, by randomly creating a waiting list when everyone can't get to the program all at once. Then we can compare the outcomes for people who benefited from the program at first to those who did not benefit until later. And because everyone is working within budget constraints, this helps us understand which programs actually work and what doesn't. So as we'll get into later, not all programs actually have a beneficial effect when evaluated this way, and some can even cause harm. So if there are more detailed questions about RCTs, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A at the end. Next slide.
Callie,
sure.
So just to say, people are saying that there's quite a lot of background noise around you. So to try and mitigate that, could you please just speak a little bit slower and louder so that we can pick out your voice from the kind of background?
Sorry about that. Is there anything I should clarify on this slide?
I think it's okay, but I think if you can just try and speak a bit louder because there is quite a lot of noise behind you.
Okay, I apologize for the background noise. So we can go to the next slide then. So the search strategy that we used for this study, now that we're clear on what the RCTs are and what kind of studies we're looking at, I'll explain how we went about conducting a search for the studies that use this methodology as applied to economic strengthening outcomes for children. So our goal was to conduct search that was systematic and replicable. We wanted to make sure we found all available studies that looked at this question. We created a set of criteria and determined whether a given study evaluation would be included in our final results. And this is our basic search strategy, what you see here. So we were looking at all studies published in English between 1990, which is about when RCTs began to be used in the development context, and 2014, when this phase of the project ended. We limited our search to developing country context only, but we did not limit the fields of included studies. We found relevant studies from economics, public health, epidemiology, medicine, and many more fields. And we used all major academic databases and reviewed publicly available studies from aid agencies like USAID and World Bank. So importantly, we would find our outcomes of interest as for children ages 0 to 18. I know the definition of this can be somewhat broader, but this was the specific group we were looking at. So usually, of course, children were not the direct beneficiaries of the program, but if the program targeted adults and measured outcomes for children, then we included it. We also excluded large-scale cash transfer programs such as Oportunidades in Mexico, because these programs are already well studied in the literature. So we were looking for novel and smaller interventions. Next slide, please. So this is what we found. Our initial search netted more than 40,000 preliminary results. And we reviewed all of these papers, but weeded out those that did not fit the criteria I mentioned before. They were not RCTs, or they were not in developing countries, or they did not have outcome measures related to children ages 0 to 18. So in the end, we had 46 studies which were part of the Save the Children report. And so I'll give you some basic information about the studies. Next slide, please. So this slide shows where the studies we found were carried out. As you can see, they were all over the world, with studies in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, as well as one study from Bosnia-Herzegovina. By far, the largest single site for these studies was Uganda, which had 13 studies, followed by Malawi with 4 and Bangladesh with 3. I'll note here that these studies are very large scale and expensive to implement, so often the research teams would conduct multiple studies in one country or publish multiple papers from one study. But there were multiple research teams working in Uganda, so this is not just from one team. Next slide, please. So this slide shows which interventions were covered in these studies. As I mentioned before, in our systematic search, we had to break down the various economic strengthening interventions into manageable categories. So this figure shows that the most common interventions were conditional and unconditional cash transfers, which is the 2 bars on the far left, CCT and UCT. Together, these made up almost half of the interventions studied. And then we also had training, group, and individual savings, microcredit, and non-cash asset transfers. Next slide, please. So this figure shows the outcome measures for children in the various studies included. Again, we broke down the wide variety of outcome measures into a set of categories so that different studies could be compared, even if they describe this. Measures were for school enrollment, which is not surprising because it was often tied to the CCT studies. The 2 other education-related outcomes were school performance and school completion. And the studies also captured a range of other measures for children, including labor force participation, household spending on children, health clinic visits, nutrition, psychological health, gender-based violence, illness, height and weight, sexual and reproductive health, and general health. And now Josh is going to talk about the analysis of the studies. Next slide.
So I have some good news and some bad news from this study, from a programming perspective, from an investment perspective. All of the types of economic strengthening that have been studied in randomized control trials that we were able to find have had 1 or more positive effects for children. So that's good news, right? All of these approaches are potentially beneficial to children. Unfortunately, we were really hoping to find a clear kind of winner among the types of economic strengthening so that we would know, hey, this is the approach to take that gets you the better outcomes most of the time. And there is no clear winner emerging from this set of documents, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Furthermore, in many outcome categories, so remember that these studies will have often, 2 or 4 or 6 or 10 different outcomes that they're looking at with regard to children. And in many categories in one study, one individual study, researchers could often find no impact on children from economic strengthening at all. So they might find a positive effect on educational attainment, but then they find no effect or on nutrition, for example. And there's no discernible pattern of when you get what kind of outcome in what category. This may match with recent findings from other multi-country research that's come out really recently showing kind of disappointing, mediocre outcomes from economic strengthening programs in general, especially like standalone programs in microcredit, in skills training. These programs are showing, if you look across countries all over the world, they're showing sort of mediocre anti-poverty results, especially if you consider how much they cost. And if a program isn't successful at reducing poverty, I'm not sure we should expect it to have positive effects on children. It is interesting to note, though, that even programs, like I said, microcredit or skills, vocational skills training, programs that are known to get sort of mediocre anti-poverty effects, it's still possible, our report shows that it's still possible to get positive effects on children in one or more category. So kind of an interesting finding. And then a little bit more bad news. More than 20% of the reports that we looked at, the studies that we looked at, show at least one negative impact on child well-being. And the negative impacts were caused by different factors. So, for example, microcredit loans intervention, working with parents of adolescents led to improved access to diverse food. So that's a good thing. But then the intervention also caused the adolescents to help out more with the family business and therefore spend less time in school. And this is pretty common to see around the world, and usually the effect is temporary and it can be mitigated. So I'm not saying we should stop doing economic strengthening interventions. It's just that we need to pay attention to these effects and know that they're happening. Again, there's no discernible pattern of these harms that result from economic strengthening being associated with any particular type of intervention. So it's not as if skills training or savings or whatever is the culprit. It's that we need to, regardless of what kind of economic strengthening program we're doing, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the negative effects that might accrue. Cali is going to talk about a few of the examples where negative effects were reported, and you'll see that they are all over the map. It's really difficult to generalize about the negative effects, but they will be fascinating to people who design programs and implement programs and who are interested in, doing no harm.
So Josh just mentioned the study about adolescents participating in a family business. That's the one on the screen right now. Next slide. I'll talk about a couple of different examples that are slightly different from this. So in another example, Sarah Baird and her colleagues from World Bank conducted a number of studies where they evaluated conditional cash transfer programs for adolescent girls. And in this case, the cash was given to the parents conditional on the girls doing well in school. So it's not a surprise that they found statistically significant levels of psychological stress for the girls because they were under a lot of pressure to perform. And finally, from a programmer perspective, another important finding comes from Colombia. This is the Barrera-Osorio study mentioned there. They found that when certain conditional cash transfer interventions were targeted by age, in other words, only available to children at a certain grade level and not others, then parents within a family tended to allocate resources towards those children at the expense of other children in the family who were in the grades not eligible for the CCT program. So this is one way in which the design of the conditional program, if it only targets school-age children of a specific age, could harm other children within families. So overall, as Josh mentioned, these point to the need to think through potential negative consequences at the program design stage and figure out how to mitigate against them. Next slide.
So Yeah, just as Kelly said, these negative effects are out there, and they're different from each other. And I think it's really worth, for programmers who've got this report that we sent around before the webinar, I think it's really worth taking a few minutes to look at the examples of negative results, just to kind of make sure that we're all understanding what can go wrong with these programs. Okay, a couple more pieces of sort of bad news. We were really interested, as I said, in looking at the mediating factors, so like sex of the beneficiary or age of the beneficiary. Would these things make a difference for how well children are served by an economic strengthening program? That was a really important question to us, and we found that there's no single mediating factor that has a strong detectable effect on children's outcomes. I think there's more work that can be done on this, but we were hoping to find an easy answer. And then we also found some sort of counterintuitive effects that Callie's going to talk about. Next slide.
So one of the counterintuitive effects we found was that the sex of the direct beneficiary may not matter for children's outcomes. So when we look in the studies that were included in this review, there were actually no consistent findings to show that targeting female caregivers with the economic strengthening program improved the impact of the interventions on child well-being outcomes. In this case, I should mention that most of the interventions targeted either women or both, did not differentiate between males and females. So that's something to keep in mind, that the gender did not seem to make a difference in this rigorous evaluation context. Next slide.
Oh, so, and on the point that Callie's making about the sex of the direct beneficiary, there may be many other good reasons to focus on female rather than male caregivers with economic interventions, but this is an interesting kind of counterintuitive finding that bears some further scrutiny, because there's other research out there that shows that, in some cases men tend to spend on different things than women do. That men, depending on the context, men may spend more on capital goods like a cement floor or a tin roof or a motorcycle, something that they could use to run a business, where women might spend more often on immediate needs. Of course, I'm generalizing, and it's totally different depending on where you are. So it's true that men and women's spending patterns may have different effects on children, and measuring the difference would really depend on when you measure in the program cycle. So it's a very complicated question, and one that I think we and others need to work on trying to unpack. Next, so turning to the gaps in the research, we found that, we focused in this study particularly only on randomized control trials, and some of them used mixed methods and did a qualitative study on the side to try to unpack the whys and the hows, but many of them do not. And just looking at these results that we've got, it's hard. It's very hard to generalize. It's very hard to understand why the effects are being observed. So we need more mixed methods work on these themes. And because we are getting these sort of mediocre results in many cases, or actually I should say, because we've seen that all the different types of economic strengthening interventions that were studied have potentially beneficial effects for children, let's figure out how much they cost in comparison to each other, and then spend more on the ones that are cheaper. We also found, because we found like hardly any cost-benefit discussion in any of these papers. And then we found, of course, very few studies done in humanitarian contexts where the need is perhaps the greatest, and that's something that we at CPC are working on trying to do. Turning to indicators in the next slide, we were surprised to find that almost nobody looks at exposure to violence. So like, does the intervention increase children's exposure to violence? There was one study that looked at gender-based violence, like one gender-based violence indicator, but we know that economic strengthening programs can lead to increased incidence of exposure to violence at the community level, at the household level, etc. So it's really something that researchers need to be digging into, and programmers in their M&E. And then finally, there's a sort of a the global child protection community has sort of banded together and agreed that a key indicator of interest is family separation. So what is the potential for a program to help keep families together? We think the potential for economic programming to help keep families together is very large, because we know that poverty is a driver of family separation in the form of labor migration, children leaving the home to work, etc. So I was a little bit shocked to find that nobody was looking at family separation or even proxies for family separation. So that's another thing that we're trying to do at Child Protection and Crisis Learning Network. And then finally, just this study has shown us that there is an urgent need for agencies and for evaluators to include children's outcomes more systematically in their standard indicators for program evaluation, for program M&E. To me, it was surprising that we could only find 46 studies out of 40,000 hits that we had in our search that happened to look at children's outcomes when, globally, we as an industry are making major investments in economic intervention. So we need to know what the effects of these interventions are on children, and it's really just sort of a mystery still. There's been a lot of work done in the last few years, but we need to do more. And part of this responsibility falls on donors who fund the evaluation research, and they should be requiring partners to collect child-level data from their economic strengthening programs. And agencies themselves need to include child-level indicators in their program M&E, even if it's an economic program for the family, for adults. So it's an important area for advocacy to ensure that agencies include these indicators. And in the chat box, I included a link to a document that was produced by FHI 360, which is a valuable resource, a short, easy-to-use resource for including child-level indicators in your M&E. And then finally, on the next slide, I just wanted to plug another resource that we developed with FHI 360. We know that there are ways to maximize benefit and minimize harm from livelihoods programming, and this is a tool that can help programmers to do that. So thanks very much to Save the Children for working with us on this study and helping us to answer some of these big important questions. And we're happy to take any questions from people in the audience. And if people want to send me an email in particular on any of these related topics, I'm happy to talk.
Great. Thank you very much, Josh and Cali, for the presentation. I think that gives us a lot of food for thought, really interesting stuff that came out of that. I would now like to open for questions. So if people have questions, could you please, because I think there are quite a lot of people online, so if you could type your question into the conversation box, and then we can take it from there. So please type away. Josh, just I guess from my side, while we're waiting for people to type, I was just wondering, because you said quite a lot about the kind of negatives that were found through the report, but what do you see as the main kind of positives or things that economic strengthening practitioners can take from this for improving our work, or do you sort of feel that it might be a bit of a lost cause?
No, I don't feel it's a lost cause at all. I hope that it doesn't come off that way. Again, so there are potential negative impacts from this kind of programming, but I really don't want people to think that we should stop doing economic strengthening programs. I think we just need to be thoughtful about monitoring to make sure that we're not doing harm, and then make program adjustments when we do see those harms showing up in our M&E. But on the positive side, there's some really interesting I think I've been doing this for about 5 years, and I feel like we finally know a little bit about what works. Maybe not down at the child level, definitely not down at the child level, but we know a little bit more suddenly about what kind of economic strengthening programs can work. I think we've been spending way too much money on technical vocational education and training and microcredit programming, and I think we need to be either following what's called the graduation model, so taking families, individuals, caregivers through a process that starts with meeting their consumption needs for cash and paying the rent and that kind of thing, and then up through a process of financial education, access to capital, access to maybe animals, that kind of thing. The graduation model is sort of a well-studied program that's out there that maybe we can provide a link to, that's just been evaluated in a sort of global multi-country way, and it's proving to be quite successful. It requires a lot of hand-holding, but at least we know it's not a waste of money the way that some of these other programs that we do have been. And then alternately, there's also a lot of positive results coming from a sort of quick and dirty kind of cash plus training model, where maybe you're either getting cash as an asset or you're getting a productive asset like an animal, and there are ways to do kind of lightweight economic strengthening in that sense that they're showing promising results. Again, I don't know what we're not looking at the child level in these programs, but at least they seem to be working for households. And the CPC network is looking at, now we have a randomized control trial running in Burkina Faso where we're looking at child level outcomes from the graduation model. So we hope to find some positive results there, and we're including indicators like family separation, exposure to violence, that kind of thing. So it's a really exciting study that we're looking for follow-up funding for. We're going to do secondary data collection starting in September, October, and we'd like to do another set of data collection in another year.
Perfect. So actually we've got a lot of questions now that have come through, so I hope we'll be able to get through at least some of them, and I think any other questions we would be able to answer afterwards as well. But I guess I'll pick out a couple of the questions for Josh and Cali. There's a question about the time frame of the evaluations. So there's a question about whether if RCTs are done in a very short time frame, does that allow enough time for us to actually properly assess the impact? So yeah, I guess that's a question for you, how you feel about that, whether we were actually able to capture the potential impact from these projects through what we were looking at.
No, the time frames are different across the studies. I mean, usually it's a year, 2 years, in some cases 3 years, and we would expect, I mean, it's just sort of intuitive that you'd expect the benefits of an economic intervention perhaps to accrue to the child further out, right? Like out 3, 4, 5, even more years. And we don't have any studies that are doing that. I mean, it's partly a function of the very high cost of this kind of study. There may be non-RCT studies out there that are doing longitudinal work looking at children's outcomes from economic strengthening, but I really don't think anybody's doing it.
Okay.
If you know of any, please let me know.
Yeah. And there's a question about whether you could unpack the finding on gender a bit. So obviously in the presentation you said that it seemed from the studies that there was not much impact or any impact found, but maybe if you can say a bit more about the finding on that and what that sort of says to you.
Sure. Yeah, it's a controversial finding, and it's not something that I'm willing to deeply commit to. I think we definitely need to be doing, us and other researchers need to be unpacking this. But it is seeming like, targeting female caregivers, I know is the norm, over targeting female caregivers for various reasons. But I think we all assume. Partly the reason we do it is that we assume that we're going to get better outcomes for the children in the household because mom is more likely to spend on the child. And it's just seeming like that might not be true, that moms and dads, female and male caregivers just spend differently on the child, and maybe the way that the child benefits from these two different kinds of spending it shows up in different ways, and depending on when you measure in the program cycle, for example. What else was I going to say about this? That right, I mentioned that men tend to spend more on capital goods than women. Another thing that was mentioned in a study that came out recently, it's not included in this study, is that in some cases, this is a study looking across at credit programs across sub-Saharan Africa, female caregiver women, when their extended family lives in the area, that they're under great pressure to share their micro business proceeds with their extended family members in a way that men are maybe more able to resist, and so there's less money in the household as a result. Now, of course, this is a gross generalization. It needs to be unpacked further, but I think we need to know that the old hypothesis that we're going to get better outcomes for children necessarily by giving women greater access to this kind of programming isn't necessarily true. But I want to reiterate, there are a lot of reasons to do more economic strengthening programming with women than men. I just want to point out that when you're looking at the level of the child, it might not make a difference.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think that this question is maybe somewhat related. It's from Karimi. In terms of the negative outcomes, did you see it as a result of the design or of the implementation where we had sort of negative outcomes?
It's a function of the implementation, I guess. Like I said, I want people to come away from this finding with a greater passion for monitoring potential negative outcomes. I don't want people to come away from this thinking economic strengthening is bad. And there are tools. I shared one, and our colleague at ILO, I think, has also shared some child level indicators in the chat box here. DOL, sorry. Department of Labor. So there are tools for doing this. And again, I would encourage, especially the person that asked that question, I'd encourage you to go look at the report in the section on the negative outcomes just to kind of understand some of the different ones, because they're different from each other and they're very context specific. And the things that the researchers observed are different from what researchers observed or chose to observe in other studies. So it's really worth looking at.
Yeah, and I think that probably does also highlight, the importance of the context, to make sure that the way it's implemented also takes that into account. I think a lot of people are writing comments after your last answer about the targeting of women to say that obviously, that finding will probably be quite context specific on whether it would be likely to have a positive outcome or not. I guess it does just show the importance of doing that monitoring to fully understand and to fully understand the context that we might not always have the same positive or negative outcomes by doing the same thing in different places, I guess.
I agree.
Another question about the research and how you would like to see the research being used in the future, and if you have any plans to expand the research.
I think there are questions that we can drill down further on, and there's even more, I think, analysis of our current data set that we could do. I think we got a lot of questions about effect sizes. So, in the cases where the researchers recorded and reported the effect sizes from the different interventions, it would behoove us, I think, to go back and try to figure out, which of these approaches that were studied had better, more impact than others. It wasn't in our remit in this study, and it's quite a lot of work, but that's one thing we can do. Some of the things that the research exposed as gaps are things that we are now trying to pursue with our own original research. So like the RCT I mentioned in Burkina Faso fills a couple of the gaps, since looking at rates of family separation from the graduation model, and we're lucky to know that the graduation model works for the household. So let's look down at the level of the child. We're looking at exposure to violence, etc. And it's in a humanitarian context, slow onset humanitarian context. So I think we'd love to see more of that kind of work done, and other groups sort of jumping in to do this, because there's so many different approaches to economic strengthening. There's so many different ways that you can measure the effects on children. It's really apples and oranges and peaches and plums to try to compare these programs to each other, and we just need more studies. I mean, 46 is not that many when you think about how many studies are done in each category. So maybe we had 5 in savings programs, for example, or I'm just making up numbers, but we just need more knowledge on these issues.
Great. Yeah. I think we've still got a bit more time. So a question about how would you reconcile the good and bad results? Were you surprised to see that that both were happening with such sort of frequency in the same intervention?
I was surprised, yes, because I mean, this is bad news in one sense that programs that get evaluated in this expensive and labor-intensive way, the randomized control trial, you tend to have bias towards successful programs in the ones that get studied and the ones that get published. So I think we can assume that 20% showing negative results is probably an underestimate of the reality in the field. So I think more programs are doing harm than 20%. But again, I don't want to encourage people not to do economic strengthening work. I think they should. I just think we need to be more thoughtful about monitoring to make sure that we're not doing harm. And part of that monitoring is about engaging children and caregivers in the participatory process to figure out, well, first to anticipate what the negative effects might be based on the knowledge that we have, and then to monitor in a participatory way to figure out what these negative effects are actually happening. And again, we've got tools on this. We wrote a guide, interviewing probably some of the people that are on this call, trying to pick their brains about what negative effects they've seen, how to maximize the benefit from these programs and minimize the harm.
Great, thanks. So, I mean, maybe looking at some of the areas specifically, there was a question around what you see as the link with child protection and child labour in particular, because I think that was a finding that did come out from some of the studies around that link. Have you got any more sort of insights to give about the potential link between economic strengthening and child protection?
We probably have. While I'm talking, maybe Cali can go find. We've got a slide on. Oh no, we don't have the outcome. Sorry. Child labor. Yeah, you get both positive and negative effects on child labor from economic interventions, and I think some of this might be a necessary evil. One gigantic revelation to me in doing this work for the last 5 years was that children are associated with nearly all micro enterprises, and most of what we do in economic strengthening is about helping people to create or strengthen their micro enterprise, right? So most of what we do is going to have direct implications for children who participate in these micro enterprises. Again, nearly all micro enterprises around the world, children are associated with them in some way. So whatever we do is going to have direct implications on how children use their time. So you do an economic intervention, and oftentimes, you get more economic activity in this micro enterprise at the household level, and the kid is now maybe working more, maybe working less, maybe working more at first and then working less later as the business grows and people get the power to pay to send this kid to school, the power to hire someone to do the work that the kid was doing before. So you see a kind of inverted U-shape over time when you bring in credit or even cash transfers, because the micro enterprise, inverted U-shape with regard to how much the kid is working and not going to school. Again, it's not that we shouldn't be doing this kind of work, it's that we need to be aware that this is probably going to happen, and we need to work ahead of time with the households to figure out how to mitigate it and make sure that we're monitoring to know that it's happening.
Yeah, and I mean, looking beyond those sort of micro enterprise, I mean, Amanda Melville has written that that in her experience, the cash transfers in Syria did not reduce child labour or early marriage or school dropout because they were not enough, and so it was spent on meeting urgent needs. Did you find that was backed up by your study at all? Were there any findings around cash transfer in particular linked to child protection issues?
No. Amanda, I hope somebody is writing a report on that topic, because I really want to read it. I totally agree, and I'm not surprised at all with what she's saying there. Yeah, the level of the cash transfer is the appropriate amount to get the effects that you want is completely context specific, and it's often subject to forces out of our control. Inflation can be rampant in emergency settings, currency fluctuations, that kind of thing. So leaving aside the child level impacts, it's just really hard to know how much to give, and the amount needs to change sometimes, and then you need to make sure that we're giving uniform amounts across populations, and then we have jealousy issues. So we've been working on we've published guidance with the Cash Learning Project and Save the Children, and we're working now on guidance with UNHCR on these questions about cash, and would love to get Amanda involved in feeding back on that. Yeah, unconditional cash, Amanda, right.
Great. And a question from Nigora, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, about what your advice would be for those who want to implement economic strengthening programs. And would you sort of recommend to have a more comprehensive approach, so including sort of other aspects in that programming? Nigora, if I got that question wrong, please unmute and let me know.
Yeah, I'm reading her question.
Yeah.
Would your advice for those who want to implement programs to have a more comprehensive approach and a kind of individual approach in working with families on economic strengthening, and having not only economic strengthening oriented services, but also some others like educational and developmental support for children, parental skills, upgrading for parents? Absolutely. It seems like standalone economic interventions are maybe a waste of money. So especially microcredit, especially technical vocational skills training. Although I know there was a question, let me answer somebody else's question about technical vocational education and training later. I think you're always going to get better results if you can be more comprehensive and work to build not only economic assets, but people's human capital in the form of education and some kinds of lightweight training, and their social capital as well. So taking a group approach seems to almost always get you better results if you can include some kind of social interaction, some kind of a group social capital building exercise or process in as part of your economic strengthening intervention. Parental skills, absolutely. We're seeing from, whose work is that? IRC, Jeannie Annan and company, their work on Savings Plus, that you do get better outcomes for children when your economic strengthening program adds on a parenting skills intervention or child protection, what's the word, education intervention, that kind of thing. This is something that we're also testing in our Burkina Faso randomized control trial. What else? On the issue of technical vocational education and training, because it's such a popular approach around the world, especially for youth, there's a big divide. So one problem with it is that it's really expensive, and has sort of mediocre results, according to multi-country research that the World Bank just did with Chris Blattman from Columbia University. Because it's so expensive, they argue that we have a moral obligation to be putting that money into something that we know works, even non-economic things like bed nets or deworming pills, etc. Then there are others, my colleagues at the ILO will say, well, yeah, but these youth, what about the youth? What about people who have their whole lives ahead of them and have no skills? The potential for this training to do them some good later on is greater. So don't we have an obligation to have some kind of youth-focused programming? I think that may be true. I'm just not convinced that it's going to get you better child well-being outcomes in that household. So more work needs to be done on that.
Okay, thank you. I think, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So thank you very much for everyone who has written questions. I know that we haven't managed to get through nearly all of them, but there will be a chance afterwards. So please, if you want to ask further questions, then please do contact obviously Josh or Cali or myself, and we would be happy to see how we could answer those and continue the discussion.
And you know what I'll do?
Yeah.
I'll go through the chat box and pull out all the questions that I can answer, and maybe I'll come up with some custom answers for those questions, and then we can share it with the group.
That would be really great. Yeah. And if anyone who hasn't yet written their sort of organisation and contact details in the box, please do, because then obviously we can send you the presentation and yeah, some of these answers. Thanks, Josh, for